S's, as we've identified suicidal desperation, are shame, sickness, stress, shunning, and signal. So I'll start with sickness, because sickness is what gets much of our attention. When we're thinking about suicide, or when a person is thinking about suicide, there can often be an element of sickness. And that sickness is often mental illness, but it doesn't have to be. It can be physical sickness too. Suicide rates can be high for those with chronic pain, chronic illness, terminal illness. And so when a person has a particular kind of sickness, that can be a cause for suicidal desperation. Another is stress. One of the contributaries to a person thinking about suicide can be stress. Financial stress, vocational stress, relational stress, all kinds of stress can contribute to a feeling of hopelessness and a feeling of despair. So suicidal desperation can have some roots of distress. Shame, which could be around issues of sin. It could be around, in Christian communities, it could be, I'm hearing a lot in this kind of Japanese culture around shame, as I'm hearing people who have issues of identity or gender and sexual identity questions, or all kinds of other identity issues, body issues that adolescents have, or 43-year-old women with body issues, right? Like we all have body issues. So those kinds of things related to shame, sin, identity, those can be contributors or contributaries to suicidal desperation. Shunning, yes, Stephen?
Oh, you're going to get the signal later.
I am going to get to signal, yes, later, yes. Shunning is another. How many of your communities practice shunning? Right? We like to tell ourselves the story that our communities no longer practice shunning.
Yeah.
We read the Scarlet Letter and we say, it's sure a good thing we don't do that anymore, right? Right. That is artificial self-congratulations. Because the truth is, we do practice shunning. How do we practice shunning?
By shunning people.
By shunning people. That's rocket science, right? What do we do to shun people, Alice?
You walk on the other side of the street or something, just so you don't have to encounter that person.
That's right. Yeah.
Tell people you don't want to hear about it.
Okay. Yeah. Just shut people down. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What else do we do to shun people?
We make them invisible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Which is a way of not having to admit that we're doing it, right? The person who got invited to the parties no longer gets invited to the parties. The person who I used to sit with, I no longer sit with. If you're doing that to me, and I come to you and I say, it seems like we're not really hanging out as much anymore. What are you going to say back to me?
There's probably an excuse, right?
I've been busy.
You've been busy, yeah.
Yeah. The thing about the shunning that we practice today that is so damaging is that we won't even admit that we're doing it. In some ways, I would argue that congregations or places or people or whatever, I lived in a conservative Mennonite community for a year, and in that conservative Mennonite community, they actively, overtly practice shunning. In the Bible, it says if a person is divorced, you shouldn't even eat with them. So if you were divorced, if there was a divorced person at a church dinner, they wouldn't eat. And you look at that and you say, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. That's an awful thing to do. And I would say at least it was clear.
Yeah.
At least people knew what was happening, why it was happening, and if they wanted to stop, how to make it not happen anymore, right? When we do it, we make an excuse, we won't admit that we're doing it, and so the person feels isolated and crazy, right? And the thing about suicide is that oftentimes, many times, one major component of this is that sometimes one of the contributaries is that a person has done something shameful. Not only are they feeling shame because of who they are, but they've done something bad sometimes, or embarrassing, or something they're not proud of. I'm an alcoholic, and it's gotten out of control. I tried to keep up with the Joneses, and eventually I stole some money. I have committed some kind of crime. I had an affair with the nanny, and I was in a midlife crisis in my mid-50s, and I was, right? Like, those are the kind of things that happen. And so a person does a thing that they're not proud of, and that all by itself is a contributory to suicide, and then the community shuns them, which makes it worse. And so we have added on to the shame of that by our shunning. So that's another contributory for suicidal desperation. The fifth contributory for suicidal desperation is what we call signal. We've written a book about it, Life, Death, and Reinvention. And the signal is that life as I know it needs to be different. Sometimes the primary driver for a person who's thinking about suicide is that they have schizophrenia and it's chronic and they can't get their head around it, and so it's primary sickness. But there are some people for whom life as they know it is no longer working and they can't find a way out, and their suicidality is a signal that life is no longer working. So here's some examples of that. So I was doing a soul shop in Atlanta, and a young girl came up to me at the very end. She was in her, I'm going to say, late 20s, early 30s. And she's Eastern European descent of some kind. She had an accent, so maybe, I don't know, the Czech Republic or something is where she was from. And she said to me, so here's my situation. I moved over here to get married. I have no family here. I am financially dependent on my husband, and I don't have a green card or whatever it would require her to work. 2 small kids, and her husband is incredibly physically abusive. And every day I am sorry that I woke up. That is a person not who is primarily sick. She's not primarily experiencing shame or has done anything wrong. Her primary issue is that she's trapped in a life that she doesn't know how to get out of. And her life is giving her a signal that something needs to die. It's just not her. I have a friend, his name is Keith, and Keith is 57 years old. I talked about him last night. Keith is an attorney. He finds his job soul-sucking. He finds that what he has to do in his work violates his conscience. He's too old to go back to school, but he's too young to retire. So he's looking at another 10 years of this vocational sort of trap. He's got 2 children, both of whom are in college, and they need his money. The family is in debt, and his marriage is in shambles. And so he thinks about suicide sometimes as a way of fixing all those problems at once. Keith doesn't have any kind of mental illness. Keith isn't sick. Keith hasn't done anything wrong or bad. He's not being shunned, and he doesn't really have shame. He's got some stress. But his primary issue is that life as he knows it is no longer working. And suicidality is a signal that something needs to die. It's just not him. And so suicidal desperation can be a signal that life as I know it needs to be different. So these are the 5 S's of, yes, Clyde?
What does that mean? Because you mentioned that last night too, and I wasn't clear there either. But something needs to die, but it's not me.
Yeah.
What is it that needs to die?
Sometimes it's a relationship that needs to die.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a vocation that needs to die. Sometimes, we were talking at the break, sometimes I'm a part of a toxic community, and my relationship with the community needs to die. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, glad you asked.